Welcome to this session of Getting to Know the Kentucky Academic Standards for Career Studies. We're going to be looking at the domain of financial literacy. My name is Teresa Rogers, and I serve as a consultant in the Office of Career and Technical Education and Student Transition. Over the course of the last couple years, the majority of my work has been focusing on the revision of the old vocational standards into what we now have as career studies, which includes financial literacy. During this session, we will discuss the creation and the scope of the financial literacy standards. We'll explore the strands within those standards, and we'll look at the professional learning materials that are available for implementation of the financial literacy standards. The Kentucky Academic Standards for Career Studies is built around three domains. The first is careers, second is essential skills, and it replaces the old employability domain in the vocational study standards, and it also includes the legal mandate of essential workplace ethics instruction, and it includes a communication strand that was developed from the old English speaking and listening standards when they were revised into the current reading and writing standards. The third domain is financial literacy, and it combines the consumer decisions and the financial literacy strands in the old standards, and it meets that KRS requirement for financial literacy as a high school graduation requirement. And the 9 to 12 grade band is the group of standards that will meet that mandate, and it was developed by a separate committee. The scope of the standards, we know that career studies and financial literacy is not a tested area, but all students have to have access to the standards through programs, services, and operational performances. We know that student access can be ensured through aligning the standards into content areas, intentionally designing enrichment programs or experiences, or standalone courses, but these all should support the development of the student's ILP. The standards are built around three grade bands: primary, intermediate, immediate, and high school. And the standards at each grade band describes what the student should be able to do at the end of that grade band. Here you see the makeup of the writing teams for the standards. We did use two separate groups to be able to tap into the expertise of the financial literacy professionals. The Career Studies group, the Business and Education Advisory Panel, included 4 different stakeholders from the business and community industries, and then 5 educators that ranged from elementary through post-secondary. They were the ones that set those guiding, the overarching structure of the standards, and then the revision and writing committee was made of 10 educators ranging from elementary through post-secondary, and they took that architecture that was created by the Business and Education Advisory Panel and actually wrote the standards. The financial literacy team worked in the same way. We had a Business and Education Advisory Panel. We had 6 stakeholders, financial literacy professionals from the community across the state, as well as 3 high school educators and 1 post-secondary educator. Because we knew that these standards would be used to meet the graduation requirement, we wanted to focus just on high school educators for this work. So they looked at all of the big buckets of work, big buckets of information that students need to know to be financially literate. They set that structure, and then we pulled in 8 educators that included 6 high school teachers and 2 post-secondary teachers, and they took that architecture and actually wrote the standards. You can see here, specifically to the financial literacy standards, what each group was responsible for. In red, you can see that the Business and Education Advisory Panel, they determined those critical domains. You can see here in the intermediate grades, you can see a clear picture of what those domains are. Careers, education, and income, credit and debt, decision-making and money management, saving and investing, money and the economy, and insurance and risk management. So they determined those strands across all of the grade bands. The Revision and Writing Committee, they came in and used that architecture that the Business and Education Committee developed and actually wrote the standards. Now, the high school standards were written by the Financial Literacy Revision and Writing Committee, and they wrote the high school standards. The standards for K through 8, those were written by members of the Career Studies writing team, and they took the architect that was created here and wrote those standards, but of course they were written in developmentally appropriate ways. Financial literacy, I want to take just a second to go through the KRS regulation because there's several critical pieces that we get a lot of questions about, and it's important to be aware of as you determine how that you're going to ensure that your students meet those requirements. So KRS 158.1411 requires successful completion of a course or program on financial literacy for high school graduation. Specifically, number 1 says that beginning with the entering 9th grade class of the 2021 school year and every year after, there has to be a successful completion of one or more courses or programs that meet the financial literacy standards before that the student can graduate high school. What I've highlighted in red, this is important to remember, it does not have to be a credit-bearing course. It can be a program, but as you go through here, we're going to look at the depth of those standards, and as you're planning to implement these standards, I would really consider how much time is required to ensure that these standards are taught to the rigor that they were intended. The second point that you see says that the Kentucky Board of Education shall promulgate administrative regulations establishing academic standards and a graduation requirement for financial literacy. And we know that that is in place for us now. The third point is focused on who determines how that's going to be taught. So we know Kentucky is a local controlled state. So the third point says that the local school-based decision-making council or a principal, if no council exists, of each high school shall determine the curricula for course offerings, programs, or a combination of course offerings and programs that are aligned to the financial literacy academic standards. Now, notice the range of options that schools have to implement these. So it can be a course offering, a program, or a combination of both. But notice the requirement that these are to be aligned to the financial literacy standards. So we have to ensure that alignment with whatever option that we provide for our students. So considering the options that the regulation gives us, how do schools choose how to offer this and provide instruction for the students? So a few things that you may want to consider: students that are taking business or family and consumer science courses, there are 2 courses within those pathways that will meet the majority of those standards. There may need to be a little bit of supplemental instruction by those teachers, but they are closely aligned to the standards. So those are money skills and personal finance. Another options that schools may want to use, we know that we have an option now for a personalized fourth math credit. So schools may choose to provide these standards as a math credit. There are 2 courses that you can see listed here, Money Skills for Mathematics and Personal Finance, that can be offered as a math credit. This can be taught by business and education teachers or math teachers. So another option that schools may choose to use. Delivering it in this option, students will have access, there'll be enough time to teach to the rigor of those standards. Other options that schools may choose to do, they may choose to partner with a post-secondary institution to offer a dual credit or an articulated credit. And again, this would be a course that's dedicated to it that students would have ample time to work through those standards. A couple other options, just because of the language of the requirement, schools may develop a program or a combination of course offerings in a variety of instructional formats. Some schools and districts may consider creating online modules that the students work through as an independent study or another structure. And then schools can choose to implement the standards systematically by section through different academic advising and enrichment session. I would caution these types of offerings and how that they're structured and how long that this would take to implement all of the standards, because we know with the transitional nature of our students moving from district to district, it would be hard to track what standards that students had access to. So the regulation does give us the option to do that, but really consider how that you can ensure that each student has full access to these standards. And then back to the KRS regulation, the 4th point states that the Department of Education shall develop financial literacy guidelines that provide direction to local schools in developing and implementing the financial literacy standards. And we'll take some time to look at resources that will be available to you as you consider how to implement those standards. The financial literacy standards, the strands that run from kindergarten through high school include careers, education and income, credit and debt, decision-making and money management, saving and investing, money and the economy, insurance and risk management. We're going to take a few minutes just to look at the different standards within the strand, but I would encourage you to go back and download the standards from the web page and actually dive into those when you have time. As we begin to look at each strand of the standards, just a quick notation about how these are titled. We see FL.H.1. The coding, FL is financial literacy, the H is high school, and the 1 is the first standard. Now, one note, if you're looking at standards across the grade bands, the content that's in the high school standard number 1 may not correlate to what you see in the primary or the intermediate grade band at standard number 1. So know that they don't follow that strict alignment like you see in the reading and writing standards or other groups of standards. So the careers, education, and income standards, these are having students really look at the relationship between careers and education and income and how that impacts lifestyle, but it also talks about what are those things that once you do get a job, how do they interpret a pay stub and those types of things. Credit and debit, We're looking at strategies to control and manage debt, and then analyzing the costs and benefits of using credit. So students should have ample time to work with real-world scenarios on this, bringing in real-world pieces of information that students can read and look at and have time to grapple with that content. Decision making and money management, we're looking at why people make financial choices, how they use decision-making models to make those decisions. They're looking at personal budgets, and they're also diving into the major types of financial institutions and their products. So they're looking at certificates of deposits, checking and savings accounts, and different services. They're also talking about how to use different payment methods, including checks and debit cards and digital service, because we know that everything is moving to that digital base in our world today. And then they're also looking at the different types of financial professionals. What's the difference between a financial planner, a certified public accountant, investment consultants, insurance agents, and those types of professionals. Savings and investing. Students are looking specifically at the time value of money. What is the opportunity cost of savings versus spending? They're looking at different investment alternatives. What's the difference between a traditional and a Roth IRA? And then they're looking at the different components of prudent investment strategies compatible with their personal financial goals. So what's the risk versus reward? What's their risk tolerance? What do we mean by diversification and rebalancing? When we talk about money and the economy, students are going to explore the different functions of money, how money facilitates trade and borrowing and those types of things. They're looking at inflation. They're looking at the role of financial intermediaries in the economy. Students are looking at how the government uses taxation to generate revenue and manage the economy, as well as how the markets determine prices and allocate scarce goods and services through the forces of supply and demand. So hitting a lot of social studies standards here as well. They're looking at the role of government as they explore unemployment, workers' compensation, Medicare and Medicaid, Social Security. All of those are included here as well as the role of different regulatory agency. What does the Federal Reserve do? What do we mean by FDIC? What does the FTC do? What is the Internal Revenue Service? And what is their role in the economy? So a lot of deep content here, as you can see. The last strand that students will be exploring is the insurance and risk management strand. So students will be looking at common types of risk management strategies, emergency funds and estate planning. They will look at different types of insurance, liability insurance, homeowners, disability, and how it would play a part in their everyday life. They're looking at strategies to protect financial information. What do we mean by identity theft and fraud, and how do they prevent themselves from becoming a victim of that? To help teachers dive into the standards and consider the content and the rigor of each of those, there'll be professional learning materials available soon on KDE's website. I will provide those resources for you in files with this presentation. But there will be two modules. The first is getting to know the CAS for Career Studies, and that's that broad overview of the standards. And it talks about the legislative requirement, the makeup of the writing teams, how to read the coding, and those kinds of things. Of particular interest to teachers will be the PLC lesson studies, and there will be 3 parts for each of the domains. and then there'll be an instructional resources alignment rubric, and we'll look at these coming up. So part 1 in that PLC lesson study, there will be listed each of the standards that you see here on the center of the table there. And the purpose of this is just to talk about what the standard is, what's the instructional techniques or routines that would support student success, common strategies and things that you might want to use across content areas or grade bands, maybe even questions or things that you need to follow up on to determine the meaning of that or locating resources. So there'll be a part 1 in each of the domains for career studies, essential skills, and financial literacy. Part 2 is an integration tool to use if you're considering integrating some of the financial literacy standards into other content areas. So this tool would be looking at a topic or a unit or standards from a content area, and then where that would align with the financial literacy standards. The third part is standards mapping. So with this, all of the standards are listed in the center column, and the purpose of this is to consider where that you're going to cover that standard within the course or the program, however that you choose to implement it. This model would be specifically helpful if you're looking at a program or a combination of a course and a program to implement these standards, just to ensure that these are being taught across that integration model. The Instructional Resources Alignment Rubric. This is a tool that's very similar to the alignment rubrics that you see for the reading and writing standards and math standards. But this tool can be used if you are considering purchasing resources for financial literacy instruction. So the major parts that we're looking at is that alignment between the academic standards and the grade band expectation, the equity and accessibility of the resources for all students, how it's organized and presented, what's the instructional design and support of this resource that you're considering, and then how are these assessed within that resource. Here are links for resources that you may find helpful. The first, the Kentucky Academic Standards for Career Studies. Remember, those include the financial literacy standards, and they are on the kystandards.org page. Also on the KY Standards page, you will find professional learning materials, but if you go there, it's with all of the standards together. In a file attached to this presentation, I've put the professional learning materials just for grades 9 to 12 financial literacy. You'll also find on kystandards.org instructional resources alignment rubric if you're considering purchasing resources and material. It helps you to determine the scope of standards that are covered, what are the additional resources that are available, what type of differentiation do they provide, what type of assessments do they use. So you'll find some useful questions there if you're considering purchasing resources for this. And then there's a document you can find on the web page, the minimum high school graduations requirements, frequently asked questions, and those are the questions on page 26 and 27 are the questions that deal specifically with how do I meet that financial literacy graduation requirement. Another resource that we are excited about is the MBA Research and Curriculum Center. This is a site that contains more than 300 lesson plans based on research. There is a personal finance course guide, lesson plans, activities, as well as assessments, and a Canvas learning management system, and Kentucky teachers get free access to the materials in the Learning Center. So here's the website for that if you want, and I would highly encourage you to check these out. To access those materials at the MBA Learning Center, send an email to helpme@mbaresearch.org with a statement that says, I am a Kentucky teacher and I would like to access the MBA Learning Center. And in the email, provide your full name and the name and the address of your school, including the city and state and zip code. And then you will get directions with your username and password in an email. If you have questions about any of this this material, you can contact Betty Montgomery at education.ky.gov or myself, Teresa Rogers, at education.ky.gov. Thank you, and I hope that you have a wonderful start to your new school year.